Hello, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us today for Planning and Environment Linkages, Interagency Partnerships, and Public Engagement. We appreciate you being here. I am Carrie Kissel, Associate Director at the National Association of Development Organizations. If you're not familiar with us, NADO works with multi-jurisdictional regional planning and economic development entities around the country, including organizations that provide regional rural transportation planning services as RTPOs, RPOs, and similar agencies. Through the NADO Research Foundation, we use federal funding and other sources of funding to do capacity building for our audiences, including regional planning and development organizations, as well as their partners in state and local governments and other kinds of stakeholder groups on a variety of areas related to our members and friends program areas, including regional and rural small metro transportation, which is why we're here today. That's a little background about who the host of today's webinar is. We'd like to know who you are, folks in the audience. So I'm going to launch a poll so that you can indicate what type of organization you represent. And if an organization that you work with is not represented in this list, since we were limited to only 5 choices, please go ahead and type that into the questions or chat box and let us know where you're from, what kind of organization you're with, whether it's local government, a regional entity, state, federal, or tribal agency. We've got several folks who have voted. I'll leave it open for just a couple more seconds if you wanted to vote. We've got a few folks that are typing into the questions box with their responses. We also have, in addition to these organization types that were represented in the survey, we also have a University Transportation Center and a handful of consultants that have joined us representing the private sector. So thank you for sharing who you are. Some housekeeping about today's webinar. We are recording the webinar and we will be posting the slides later on today to our website, ruraltransportation.org, and you'll be able to find that on the homepage of that website. Later on this week, we will have the recording of today's webinar also posted. You can share your comments and your questions throughout today's webinar in that questions box that several of you have already found. We'll wait to hold Q&A with all of the speakers until the end, but please go ahead and submit your questions as soon as you think of them at any time throughout our webinar today. The NADO Research Foundation is an approved AICP certification maintenance provider for those of you who are members of the American Planning Association and are AICP certified planners, and we'll be entering that into their system later today as well. So you'll be able to log in and add credits for today's webinar into your CM log. Today's webinar is sponsored through our work that's conducted in partnership with the Federal Highway Administration. So many thanks to Federal Highway for partnering with the NADO Research Foundation since really about the early 2000s on capacity building and training and research for RTPOs, rural transportation, and small metro transportation stakeholders and other kinds of partners. It's been a wonderful partnership and we very much appreciated it. Today, during the webinar, we'll hear from 3 speakers. Lana Lau will kick us off. Lana is an environmental protection specialist with the Federal Highway Administration in the Office of Project Development and Environmental Review. Then we'll hear from Brian Hare, the Director of the Center for Program Development and Management with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. And finally, we'll hear from Beth Burks, the Executive Director of the Humboldt County Association of Governments. So I'm now going to turn things over to Lana.
Thank you, Carrie, for that introduction. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Carrie said, my name is Lana Lau. In my capacity as an environmental protection specialist in FHWA's headquarters office of project development and environmental review, I'm one of our program leads for the Planning and Environment Linkages program. I'm also a co-lead on the EDC 6 Virtual Public Involvement Initiative, among other things. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a general disclaimer that nothing of what I'm covering today should be considered actual guidance, although I will be referring to some statutes and regulations. So, if you are interested in learning more about planning and environment linkages and some of our resources, I'll cover that later on in the presentation. For today, if you're not already familiar with Pell, I'll give a general overview of what Pell is and what the benefits can be to taking a Pell approach to developing your planning and project information, the various flexibilities that are available to you as Pell practitioners in using a Pell approach, some best practices, and then I'll cover some resources that can help you if you're trying to start in doing Pell or taking it a little bit further. So Pell is a collaborative approach to transportation decision-making, and its ultimate goals are really to enable you to consider a variety of factors such as environmental, community, and economic goals early on in the transportation process so that you can use information that you've developed in the planning process in order to inform the environmental review process. And as we'll talk about, this has numerous benefits, one of which is to reduce duplication of effort between the planning process and the environments review process. But really the ultimate goal is just to improve decision making and to accelerate project delivery. And so some of the benefits of Pell, as I just suggested, are to accelerate project delivery by addressing and identifying issues early on, and to align your projects and your plans with future requirements. It can stimulate the development of new tools to better integrate the planning and environmental review processes, such as the use of geographic information system tools. It helps you really build some better relationships with agencies and the public, and encourages early engagement in the decision-making process. And so all these and other benefits can be part of taking a Pell approach. In terms of what Pell looks like today, and Pell has been around since, 2005, but with safety loop, but really even before that, in the 1978 CEQ NEPA implementing regulations, already CEQ was encouraging practitioners to use planning information to inform the NEPA process and to incorporate documents and information by reference. And so those were the early days of Pell, the concept of linking planning and environmental review. But with Safety Lou, and then later on in MAP 21, and then the FAST Act, there were additional Pell authorities, whether in statute or regulation, that were introduced that resulted in all the different flexibilities that we currently have. But you can take your planning analysis, whether that's land use studies or mitigation planning, and take that into account in your planning process to make some certain planning decisions, whether it's provided in a discrete Pell study type format, or whether it's just documentation of a preliminary purpose and need or a range of alternatives that you can then take into the environmental review process. And this information is not just useful in the type of large, complicated projects like your EISs, but also can be used for other classes of NEPA actions, such as environmental assessments and categorical exclusions. In terms of funding for Pell, we often get asked, can you use planning funds to fund a Pell study? And yes, you can. You can use PL and SPR funding, and just remembering that once the NEPA process is initiated, that the project is no longer eligible for those PL or SPR funds. And so there's a link there to provide you with a little bit more information about that. There are some general Pell considerations, regardless of which Pell authority or authorities you are using. And these are considered just general best practices when you're doing planning and preparing for environmental review, is to follow your approved transportation planning process and to solicit participation and engagement from your federal, state, stakeholders, as well as Indian tribes, and provide an ample opportunity for early and continuous public engagement and public comment using the best available data and scientifically acceptable methodologies that you have access to, involving the FHW division office or the FTA regional office, depending on the type of project you have. And of course, preparing appropriate documentation if you are intending to use the information in NEPA, that you understand what NEPA level of documentation is in order to be able to use that information. And so this is a very much simplified chart of the different Pell authorities that are available. And so we just looked at the general considerations that are best practices, regardless of which Pell approach you use. And then we encourage practitioners to start not with the authorities themselves, but by considering what your desired outcome is in taking a Pell approach, or what your desired outcome is coming out of the planning process, whether that's to define a preliminary purpose and need, or eliminate some unreasonable alternatives from consideration, or whether it's to incorporate some information from your planning studies into the NEPA process. And so depending on which outcome or outcomes you would like to have, then you can select the appropriate Pell authority or authorities and review the specific requirements of those authorities in order to be able to use your planning products or planning decisions in the NEPA process. And so there are various statutory and regulatory authorities that are listed there. These are some examples of planning products, and a planning product is any decision or analysis, a study, or other documented information that is the result of an evaluation or decision-making process carried out by an MPO or a state DOT during a metropolitan or statewide transportation planning process. And so really it covers a whole gamut of studies and information that you might typically be developing in the planning process or some preliminary decision making. And these, such as travel demand forecasting or land use growth information, can be used in the NEPA process. And this table kind of outlines a couple of ways or areas in which this type of information can be used to support the environmental review process. More specifically, if we consider a purpose and need, you can begin developing a purpose and need in the planning process in collaboration and coordination with your resource and regulatory agency stakeholders and with the public. That if you document the process that you went through and the comments, that you can take that purpose and need into the NEPA process. Similarly, if you are interested in developing a preliminary range of alternatives for consideration and further study in the NEPA process, you have the ability, using specific Pell authorities, to eliminate unreasonable alternatives from consideration. And those would be based on, again, public input. You would document the methodology or screening factors you used. And so those are just some examples of how you might incorporate specific planning products into the NEPA process. And when it comes to Pell best practices, we already talked about the general considerations, but also to take into account, really scope out the the work that you need to do before the environmental review process, and consider what budget and schedule you have, because some of the Pell authorities require the planning decision to have been made within 5 years of the beginning of the NEPA process. So you kind of have to time things a certain way depending on the Pell authority. You know, how much money, resources you have to put into your planning process, and whether, if you might call it a Pell study, and make sure to, you know, share information and data with the agencies and stakeholders, and keep a comprehensive record of all your data and analysis and decision making as part of the documentation of your efforts. And so here are just a couple of additional resources that are maybe newer. You may not have realized that we've recently put up on our website. So here's a link to our FHWA Environmental Review Toolkit website, specifically the section where we've posted some new hypothetical case studies. And so if you're interested in developing alternatives in the planning process for use in NEPA, or you know, using planning studies or the purpose and need, there are specific case studies that we have developed to illustrate, you know, in a particular context, how you might apply the different Pell authorities and go about developing the information planning and using it in the environmental review process. Additionally, during the last year, maybe it was a year and a half ago, we revamped our NHI Planning Environment Linkages course to be offered virtually. So now that we're sort of back and able to travel, you have the ability to request the course either for an in-person delivery or for a virtual delivery. And so these are the course numbers. There's the in-person delivery, there's a virtual delivery, there's also an option for an extra module in which we take you through some activities in order to actually sort of think out, plan out a particular Pell project of your own. So, and you can use that link to access the NHI course website for more information. And some other Pell resources. Recently, we, the FHWA EDC 6 Virtual Public Involvement Team, hosted a webinar with a couple of state DOTs to talk about how they used virtual public involvement in their Pell processes. And that webinar was recorded, and the presentation is available for you to view at any time. So that's that link. We also have a Federal Aid Essentials Pell video that gives you a general overview of the Pell process and the different Pell authorities. And then finally, we have a tool, the PlanWorks Pell application, that helps steps you through the different resources or agency or organizational factors that you might want to consider, whether you haven't yet started implementing Pell and you want to see what how you need to align yourself in order to get started, or ways to assess where you currently are, and areas where you might potentially tweak your process or your organization in order to improve your Pell process. And so I just wanted to, for you as a takeaway, remember that Pell is a very flexible approach in that you can use any variety of Pell authorities in order to go about this, and there are different requirements depending on the specific authority, and that you know, there are numerous benefits to incorporating your planning products into the environmental review process, as we discussed, reducing duplication of effort, accelerating project delivery, and really building relationships and making better decisions. And so I thank you for your attention. I'll turn things back to Carrie.
Thank you, Lana. That was a great overview of what Pell is and what some of those resources are that folks can find some additional information. A note to all the attendees, in the handouts portion of your GoToWebinar panel over on the side of your screen, we've placed all of the slides that the presenters are using today. So if you wanted to access any of those links that Lana was discussing, all of those are in the slides. Those are available for download as a PDF, and we'll also be sharing them on our website after the webinar is concluded. We are going to move along, and next we'll hear from Brian Hare about what Penndot's activities are.
Very good. Carrie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Very good. There we go. I was waiting on the slide change. Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon. My name is Brian Hare. I'm from Penndot, and I was asked to spend a little time talking about our Penndot Connects process, which I promise you I will do. But as I started to sit and plan for this, I decided to take a little different course, so thank you for bearing with me. What I'm really going to do today is talk a little bit about the journey on how we got to Penndot Connects, which is why you'll see the title of my presentation is Linking Planning and NEPA and Integrating Land Use and Transportation and a whole lot more. We've come a long way through the years, and this is really kind of maybe a glimpse on my own personal journey at Penndot through the years more than anything. So hopefully you find this as informative as I did pulling this together. And with that, I just wanted to share a little bit about Pennsylvania, if you're not familiar, more from a planning perspective. Pennsylvania is a state that involves a lot of local governments. We have 11 Penndot engineering districts in Pennsylvania. They are numbered 1 through 12. There they are. And we have our 23 metropolitan and rural planning organizations. They're shaded in the graphic that just came up. We have 1 independent county in Pennsylvania. And I'll just go through the numbers real quick. Again, that's the breakdown of all the municipalities in Pennsylvania. But when you look at it by the numbers, there's almost 2,600 of those local governments, the municipalities. We have 67 counties in Pennsylvania. There we go. And again, the 11 engineering districts. Well, point to make is that only counties in Pennsylvania are required to have comprehensive plans. Municipalities regulate land use, however, in Pennsylvania, but only 50 to 60% have zoning requirements in place. And there are very limited resources at the municipal level, and I can probably say that's also at some of our regional offices as well, our planning partners. Again, so that's just a real quick background on what Pennsylvania looks like kind of from a land use and from a planning perspective. For sure. So what I want to get into today is a discussion, again, of the history of linking planning and NEPA, as we call it in Pennsylvania, how we changed the rules, where we've been, and then I promise I'll get to Penndot Connects, which is kind of the where we are today. But please keep in mind, it's all about the journey. And having said that, I don't know how many, we didn't ask the question. We asked where you're from or what you do. We didn't ask how long you've been doing it. I'm going to, again, kind of date myself a little bit here. How many folks remember context-sensitive solutions with your working with your DOT? We got into the context-sensitive solutions back in the 1990s, probably the mid-90s, and that was our attempt to basically tie design criteria with the context, with the surrounding land use, not just looking at the pavement or the bridge, but how that all fits together. And I'll talk a little bit about our smart transportation journey, which leads us into the 2008 timeframe. And then it was really that process that came about to implement that smart transportation guidance that I'll talk about. That was our linking planning and NEPA process in the early 2010 time frame, I'll say. So, why are we looking at this? Big focus on asset management. Hopefully you can appreciate that as a DOT. It's about pavements, it's about bridges, but it's about a whole lot more when it comes to asset management. Part and parcel to the asset management is limited financial resources. Again, I believe most folks can relate to that and appreciate that fact. And that, to address our assets in a state of good repair is very expensive. Even with our IIJA or bill funding from the federal government, thank you, we appreciate it, but it's not nearly enough. We're still struggling. And the other key, one other key is land use issues. We like to show this illustration that really does look at how a facility is designed, and is it walkable? Does it regulate speed? Does it encourage folks to travel at the speed you like them to? All issues that are rolled up into our process. But it's also, you can't talk about transportation without talking about technology today. Technology is a key. When I started, again, dating myself, we didn't know what cell phones were. They didn't exist. And then we got BlackBerries, and then the rest is history. But it's also technology in transportation and technology for all users, and how we make that experience better through the leveraging of technologies. Again, other themes that we've talked about in the past is public expectations. That was a really big deal. And if there was more time, I could share the story I shared with Carrie about this slide. This was about a Bike to Work challenge, and one of the speakers actually became our Secretary of Transportation, and I'll talk about her in a little bit. But what I'm going to talk about next is just how we've moved it forward with changing the rules of basically the rules of engagement to focus more on communities. It's all about communities and as they relate to our transportation investments, and again, tying in land use, transportation planning into that approach. And this brings me to our discussion of smart transportation. Again, it's been a long time since I've talked about this, but I'm happy to talk about it again because it all builds. Hopefully that's the message you'll hear in this. But smart transportation was all about flexible design, and that means tying your design in with the local land use issues, tying the roadway design into the context. And it's, what does context mean? We defined it as 5 issues. The land use context, what's happening? How is that area built? Is it an urban core? Is it a town village? Is it a rural area, or is it something else? And the smart transportation actually developed engineering design criteria tied to the various context. There's also the community context. What's the community's vision? I apologize, now it's jumping ahead too soon. What are the issues relative to environmental stewardship? What are the transportation context issues? Something it's obvious, but sometimes not thought about is, what's the facility intended to provide for local access or for high-speed mobility through an area? And Lana touched on this, the financial side of it, is make sure we understand our budget early in the process, and then design to that budget, because again, funding is extremely limited. So then, implementing the smart transportation, that's where we as an organization move forward with our linking planning and NEPA process, as we've called it. And again, that was developed through coordination with a lot of different folks, including planning partners and rural planning organizations in Pennsylvania, as well as our Federal Highways PA Division office. But it was all about increased collaboration, earlier collaboration, and then following that process. I'll talk a little bit about that process without getting into a lot of detail throughout. And again, this was roughly in the 2011 timeframe, but to touch on a few points that I think Lana touched on very well. What was linking planning and NEPA all about? It was spending a little time, little investment earlier in the process to better understand the problem, better understand that purpose and need, get a better understanding, a better handle on the scope of work, which leads to a better understanding of our schedule for delivery, and a better handle on our budget, which leads to better programming, which is important to start out with kind of an eyes wide open approach. I talked about the process. This is the process that we had developed. Again, I know it's hard to see, so I'll just focus on the keys. The real key is to start with the problem. It's not a project yet. You start with the problem, and then you work to define that problem. That becomes the proposal in planning. It's not a project yet. But as you work forward, you move through that clarity that gives you the better scope, schedule, and budget. As you put a project on the tip, the program then can move into project delivery, again, with a better understanding of the expectations. There we go. We developed a system. Lana mentioned systems and technology. We developed a system for one, providing GIS information. It was roughly 40 layers built into our linking, planning, and NEPA system when it was created. But it was also for documentation. Documentation's key. It's one thing to get a better understanding of a proposal that then becomes a project, but if you lose that information, what did you get out of it? So we wanted to make sure we had a good system for documentation, and that's what our linking, planning, and NEPA system was all about. And then we worked to basically institutionalize what we've learned in that process. We put it into our long-range transportation plan guidance for regional MPOs and rural planning organizations. And we also incorporated into our Design Manual 1. Design Manual 1 is our project process for both program development and project delivery. So having said all that, where are we today? And today's journey brings us to the Penndot Connects approach, and a little bit of background and history on that. In 2015, we had a new secretary at Penndot, and she was a former planner. She was a planner at the local government level. Good to see some local governments represented today, but she was also a county planner. And she actually worked at the regional level as well with our Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission down in the Southeast in the Philly area. So she brought that passion for planning to Pennsylvania, and that really made all the difference with Penndot Connects. By the end of 2016, less than 2 years really into her time here, we had that process signed, and or I should say the policy was signed, and the training was underway to move forward with the new process. And it was really a big culture change. I mean, I say all of these efforts built one upon the next. I will say probably more than any of the others, this really had the focus of our executive staff, and it wasn't just kind of a guide or a suggestion. It was a thou shalt, and that was that our district offices and our planning partner staff were to meet with local government on all new projects added to a program. So again, it wasn't just the large projects, EIS or environmental assessment projects. The requirements for all projects to have this involvement, this coordination, and this meeting. And so, what were the things we talked about? It was all about identifying community issues early in the process. We have a lot of data at Penndot, as all DOTs do. We understand our bridges. We know what the conditions and the ratings are. We understand our pavements and the IRI and the OPI and all the other acronyms that you want to throw into the engineering and data world, but we don't live there. So that was what Connects was all about, helping us understand things that we couldn't see with our eyes or touch with the data that we had. It could be mobility issues. It could be stormwater management. I'm reminded by some of our local government folks that it's not all about transportation at the local government level. It's really about water issues, water resource issues, and such. So we get that. But the ask was, we wanted to see some basis for these decisions. If we go out and ask the community, what can you do? What are the issues that we can possibly incorporate into our project? What do you have planned? Do you have utility issues planned? Are there bike ped issues planned? Maybe we can work those in, but we wanted to see some demonstration that there was at least a documentation, not saying a formal plan even necessarily, but some documentation. But cost was an issue, and I'll talk about that a bit. And that was part of the culture change as well, that think about cost in terms of what are the benefits, not just what are the costs that could be provided. Again, the system that we had in place has been enhanced through Penndot Connects. We actually went to an Esri-based GIS platform that gave us much greater functionality. So we continue to enhance the data that we have. And again, the real key is that documentation. So, just to start to wrap things up, I talked about cost relative to Connects a bit ago. And again, kind of a cultural change. A thought was, let's not just think about the costs, but let's focus on what the greater value is to address accessibility issues, opportunities for broader community improvements, because this may be the only opportunity this community may have for 15, 20 years through this transportation project to address things like economic competitiveness or quality of life issues that could be surrounding that our roadway or bridge project due to walkability issues or other such things. And our secretary, she really put out a challenge to our district offices and our staff here in central office where I work, what can we do to seek opportunities to leave a community in a better condition than what we found it overall, not just with the transportation improvement, but with the overall improvements to quality of life. So that, again, was a real change, kind of a sea change in the way we approach projects. And then I'll just leave you with this last quote. At the time we were developing this in the mid-2016 timeframes, we came across this NCHRP study. It's 798 if you're interested. But the quote from that study was that DOTs are no longer just held accountable for the transportation system, they're also held accountable for how that system supports and improves quality of life for communities. And we really took that to heart, and that became a real core of our training and outreach to our internal staff and also communities throughout Pennsylvania. So that is my presentation. There should be a thank you slide popping up. There it is now. So I appreciate, again, the opportunity to share a little bit with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks for bearing with us as those slides jumped around a little bit. Appreciate your flexibility in handling slides that were a little too fast and a little too slow. I appreciated how you discussed that connection between the levels of government, from the state to the regional planning partners to the local governments, as well as those other kinds of relationships in how Pennsylvania has navigated evolving that planning and environment linkages process over time. But next we're going to hear from a practitioner at the regional level, Beth Burks, who is joining us from California. Go ahead and move the slide and give you keyboard and mouse control.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here today, and I think my presentation will hopefully tie some of this together from the perspective of building the relationships in terms of the Pell process, kind of building relationships and early and continuous public involvement, and then how we can do some comprehensive documentation of that so that it could help inform further work and be what is needed later on in the process as well. Hang on one sec. There we go. So just a little bit about what is Hcog. So we are the designated regional transportation planning agency for Humboldt County. So our members include the County of Humboldt and our 7 incorporated cities. And we are a very tiny staff. Our entire staff is 4 people. That includes me as the executive director and 2 planners and a financial officer. So that's it for us. Very rural environment. Humboldt County is located in the far reaches of Northern California. We're about 4.5 to 5 hours north of San Francisco, and still an hour and a half from the Oregon border, right along the coast in the heart of the Redwood Forest. So not a bad place to call home, all things considered. We do have several tribal nations within our county, and we work closely with these tribal nations. And today I'm speaking to you from Wiyot territory, and happy to be doing so. So Humboldt County, the reason I think this is relevant is because we're going to talk about public outreach and some of our demographics in our rural area. It certainly impacts the way that we're able to do public outreach and what is successful. And so we have a population, total county population of 136,000. We cover an area of 3,500 square miles. So you can see on the chart here, our population density is far below the US average, and compared to the rest of California, extraordinarily below. So most of our population is centered around the Humboldt Bay region, and it gets excessively rural after that. So definitely it could take someone in the far reaches of our county several hours to get to the county seat on the coast. Some special considerations in addition to just our rural nature is that we have higher rates of poverty here in the county than the state or national averages, higher rates of people with disabilities, and higher rates of transportation-related death and injury. So we keep those demographics in mind as we do our work and make sure we're trying to reach out to the widest section of our community. So why public engagement? I think we all know about this, but I think one thing I wanted to talk about was just at Hcog, we're a little bit obscure. So like I said, we have a staff of 4, and I think if you were to ask around the county, what is Hcog? I would say the vast majority of people have never heard of us. They don't know what we do, who we are, what our purpose is. And so when we look at doing public engagement for any project, it really is also an opportunity to raise awareness about the importance of transportation planning and to make sure the community is aware of the work that we do and really why they should care. Quite frankly, because I think it can seem a little obscure, especially when we're planning really at these comprehensive, larger plan levels sometimes that aren't necessarily project specific. It gets really hard to translate that into, why the community should care. So we use every opportunity we can to kind of raise that awareness about our organization. And to continue to build those relationships. And we really do want to make sure we're hearing from a variety of voices because we're not widely known. We tend to hear from the same groups over and over again, and their voices get really, really loud. And it's great to have them because we do hear a lot from the bike community and others who are very sensitive to or very concerned with climate, and those are very important high priorities of ours as well. But we want to make sure those aren't the only voices we're hearing, that the everyday person is also participating, and that we can really do a robust enough public engagement to inform our work based on the desires of our community. So I wanted to give just sort of a case study of our regional transportation plan, the outreach we did. And then I think, trying to tie it back to the Pell process is really just how we document that so that it can be relied upon moving forward. So we really did try everything for a regional transportation plan. We were lucky in that we had a grant that supported our work. So our tiny staff was really augmented by consultants that we hired. And for the public outreach, we went with the local community action agency to help us with our outreach. And one, they have great experience doing outreach, but we are also by hiring, the nonprofit community action agency that has a great reputation in our community and so many, just so many connections. We were able to leverage that and reach populations we would not have had any access to otherwise, or would otherwise not be interested in hearing from Hcog, but we're very accustomed to hearing from folks at the community action agency. So that was really beneficial. We did surveys, and I'll talk about those more in a little bit. We did a virtual public meeting, and the main thing I want to say about that is just that we did the virtual public meeting at the end of the process after we'd been doing all this other outreach. And so at that meeting, we were able to take back what we've heard so far and really have breakout sessions about, hey, folks who are here, what do you think about what we've been hearing out in the community? Are we nailing it? Are we getting it right? Or is this not representative of what you would like to see prioritized? So it made for a really meaningful discussion at that virtual meeting because people kind of, we were able to share what we've been hearing. We did pop-ups throughout our region, and I'll talk more about those in a sec as well. Direct stakeholder outreach. This was, typical email blast, that kind of thing, but also we did phone interviews or Zoom interviews, and we went to specific community organizations. And one highlight I'd give on that is we went to the Promotores, which was a Spanish-speaking group of sort of community healthcare providers, and we gave our presentation. One of the people on our consulting team was a Spanish speaker, so that was really helpful. We gave our presentation. There were no comments about our presentation whatsoever. It was like, yeah, thank you for coming. And then we stayed for the rest of the meeting. And although, when asked directly, do you hear about transportation issues in the community? And there wasn't a lot to say. When we stayed for the rest of the meeting, we heard what we needed to hear. We heard about, people struggling to access from where they live to get to healthcare resources because the sidewalks weren't contiguous. And we heard about some of the transit related challenges people were having. And so, just that if we hadn't stayed for the whole meeting or we hadn't got this invite, we wouldn't have really heard that aspect. And even asking directly didn't get us there. So it was definitely a clue to us to just get into, sort of as many nooks and crannies of our community as we could, so that we were hearing from as many voices as we could. Then we did all the traditional stuff, press releases, presentations at civic groups, again, just really trying to boost the awareness, not just about the regional plan we were working on, but our organization in general. Radio interviews, and we posted flyers throughout the county. So on the surveys, so I know this is really just a very old school approach. This isn't like any kind of cutting edge technology. We did have good success with the surveys though, and they ended up being really important and really great for documenting what we were hearing. And one thing we did that was really helpful with the surveys is we used a QR code. So anytime we did any publicity about the regional transportation plan, we included that QR code to the survey. We got 350 responses, which I'm sure, for people from, large areas, that seems like almost nothing. That was record breaking for us to have 350 individual responses. And we had standardized questions that were easy to quantify, but then we had open-ended questions that were, just really like what's important to you. And we got some great information out of those. And then we coded those. So were people talking about bike and ped issues? Were people talking about safety issues? And so we could, even with the open-ended questions, we could then quantify that and really make some conclusions based on what we were seeing. And we did pop-ups, as I was showing you. We're a really, really rural area. And so it's not, it's not reasonable to expect everyone to, come into the county seat and think that we're gonna reach a wide variety of our population. So we certainly did, we went to the mall, things like that for pop-ups, but more than that, we hit farmers markets in rural areas, we hit health fairs, things where, again, people might not think like they went there to talk about transportation, but they still were able to, interact with us and start having those conversations and thinking about what we do at Hcog and what's important to them and their transportation infrastructure. And we had a little money game there where they could, we gave them 500 fictitious dollars, and they decided, what do they want to put that money towards? Filling potholes, or, fighting climate change, safety features, or more bike and pedestrian access. So we had these buckets, and I will say that was really entertaining because it definitely changed some of our assumptions. Some of these more rural, known to be pretty conservative areas, they still were piling in the money for fighting climate change, and I don't think we would have thought that otherwise. And so it was nice to see themes emerge and kind of be able to tie those to locations. And we would bring these maps with us that you can see in the photos, and they would be able to put little stickies, just old-fashioned, right? Little stickies about, talking about their area, but be able to look at it, in real time outside, enjoying each other's company. So all of that, I think, again, some of this may not seem all that, exciting in terms of the outreach, but I think it really did give us good information, and we felt like we really reached a broad range of our community. And then I think, where we really kind of shine in this is how we documented that outreach. And of course, we put this high-level summary in the text of our documents that's required by law to say, how did you do your public outreach? So we've got a couple pages about it. But then we also have Appendix A, which is our public outreach and engagement program. And this is 142 pages long, and that's almost as long as the document itself, but we documented everything. So all those stickies people were putting on their maps at the pop-ups, those are all captured in our appendix verbatim. and you know, it says what location we heard this at, and what we heard and what they wrote. All the meetings we went to, all the notes from that, the breakout session notes at the virtual meeting. We go painstakingly through everything and just really compile it. And you know, it was a fair amount of effort to compile it in that way. But I would tell you, it's been so helpful to move forward with having that compilation. Again, we just document in its entirety. The benefits is now that it's in this great big PDF with all of our outreach efforts, it's searchable. And so, you know, we could say, hey, did we hear about that in that community? And we could take a look at that. We have, you know, and it's really been able to inform other plans and projects. So some of the things that we were able to get out of it, for example, is one of our communities, Blue Lake, was applying for a grant recently. And when we were helping with the background information for that grant, we were able to say, you know, at a recent pop-up event in Blue Lake, you know, this many people really prioritize this commuter trail as the most important thing for their community. And so they didn't have to go and do a bunch of extra outreach. We just recently been out to their community. We heard what people had to say, and we could kind of just insert it right where it needed to be. And we've had a few examples like that, and it sure has been rewarding to see it kind of manifest in that way. I don't know that that's why we were thinking of it, to kind of quantify it in this way, but it has been really, really helpful. So I think what has worked really well for us is, you know, again, partnering and hiring community groups who have the skill and connections that could extend our reach. And we did provide a variety of opportunities and methods for participation. And then again, just documenting everything. It gives us that treasure trove. We can data mine it later. And it's been really useful for us to have that level of detail. And I think it also really helps with transparency for the public. You know, if they wrote a letter during this process or sent us an email or had a phone call with us, they can see that reflected in this essay or in the appendix. They know that they weren't forgotten, and that they were part of the information that went into creating the plan. And we do certainly have some continuing challenges. And like I said before, just, you know, helping people understand why they should care, I think is always a challenge for us when we're talking about these big level comprehensive plans. And it's not like filling a pothole in their neighborhood or fixing that street or adding that sidewalk. And certainly we do plans that are more specific, but certainly at that comprehensive level, I think it's hard to get people to understand, like, what does this mean to me and why is it worth my time? We do see the participation fatigue. We have a lot of really engaged community members, but they get spread really thin. And then, you know, just how to reach the most underserved in our community continues to, you know, challenge us and make sure that we are reaching those populations that we don't hear from and don't always have the biggest voice. And then this last one I want to just talk about for a minute is, you know, one of our continuing challenges and something we really are focused on working on moving forward is making our relationships less transactional so that we keep up that momentum and people didn't just hear from us like, oh, we're making this plan. We need to continually tell people, okay, here's what went in the plan and here's what we're doing about it and here's why you should care. And so, and what it can mean moving forward for you and your community. So I think making those relationships less transactional, not just the one-off because we have, you know, this one plan going on right now, and kind of that continuous public outreach is a challenge, especially when we are just a staff of 4. So that's actually what I wanted to quiz the group about was if you have some examples of ways that your organization is dedicating staff time and resources to ongoing relationship maintenance with stakeholders in your communities. So if you feel so inclined, I'd love to see some of that in the chat. And Carrie can help us manage that a little bit. Will you get your juices flowing? If you have some examples, I'd love to see them. I'll give you just a couple. One from our regional transportation plan. We had grant funding with that, as I mentioned, and we were able to, we didn't use it all. And so we actually extended that funding for another 6 months, and we're going to be able to reuse the remaining funds to continue the outreach. And now it's not about how to inform the plan, but it's about getting back to all those stakeholders and saying, thank you for participating. And here's what it looks like now. And here's the next steps and how you can get involved in those, and really closing that loop. We've certainly heard time and again that, you know, people get frustrated about, you want my input and then you don't, you know, how do I know if you used it for anything? So we want to we want to definitely close that loop. And then not an RTP or not a regional transportation plan specific example is we are very involved with the North Coast Tribal Transportation Commission. This is a consortium of tribes in a 3-county area, and we attend their meetings monthly and offer updates. But recently they lost a consultant that they were working with who was providing a lot of the administrative support. So we were able to jump in and just say, I just offered, do you need help? We can do your minutes. It's about 20 minutes extra effort on our part, but it goes a long way to build that trust and just show them that we're backing them up. And we think that, them meeting as tribal organizations is good. And, just again, that continuing dialogue is open and we show support for one another in that way. So, all right, Harry, I would ask you, is there anything you saw in the chat? Has anybody given us any ideas?
Yeah, there's an idea here from Kevin Butner, who is in Eastern Ohio, about conducting countywide caucuses to give more tailored briefings. If anybody else has other examples of ways that your organization is dedicating some staff time to ongoing relationship maintenance, please share that in the questions box either now or as we get into the Q&A. If you think of something here in a few minutes, we'll go back and share that out again.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for sharing that. And that's the end for me. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak, and put my contact information there, and just thank you.
Thank you, Beth. I'm going to go ahead and advance us in the slides a little bit. While you guys are thinking of some additional questions for our presenters, I'll have a couple of follow-up slides here in our presentation. If you are able to travel this summer, we'd love to see you at our National Regional Transportation Conference. It is national in scope, but much of the content relates to regional, rural, and small metro transportation. And that's typically attended by between 120 to 150 or more regional transportation professionals from rural and small metro regions, as well as regions that are mixed rural and urban, as well as their partners working in state DOTs, at the local government level, in rural transit, and other types of stakeholders that are working on similar issues. We recently had a call for presentation abstracts, and I'm really excited about the variety of things that people have volunteered to share. We'll be fitting those puzzle pieces together here in the next couple of weeks and release a draft agenda. Let us know if you have questions about that. Right now, we also currently have our awards program open. If your organization is a NADO member, please consider submitting your work and sharing what you're up to through our Excellence in Regional Transportation Awards process. Our initial deadline is this Friday. If you would need a little bit longer to complete something, we'll be beginning to review those by the week of April 18th. Just let us know if you'll need a little bit of extra time. Love to see what you're working on. You can find our presentation materials from today, as well as other kinds of information and resources on our ruraltransportation.org website. And we also send out periodic rural transportation newsletters that include not just the publications and the trainings that NADO and the NADO Research Foundation work on, but also other things from federal partners, technical assistance centers, university centers, other associations, any kind of resource that we see about information or potential funding, training opportunities. We try to pull that together into our website and our newsletter. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions about our work or would like any more information. I'm going to go ahead and pull the slides down, and speakers, you can join us back on screen again so we can have some time for Q&A. We've got a few things that have come into the questions box. And remember, audience, if you've got some questions, please feel free to go ahead and type those in. We've got a question for Beth. In Appendix A to the plan, did you keep or remove participant names and identifying information?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I was going to say, I know you shared a link to that with me. I'm going to share that appendix URL with the audience as well. Okay, there we go.
We kept names kind of consistent with like you would like for a Public Records Act request. So, you know, not the name of everyone who was in a breakout session, for example, but if somebody sent us an email directly, then yeah, their name would be included. I believe we tried to block out like addresses, things like that, if they included that in their, you know, in their signature. But definitely like the list of 165 individuals that we reached out to and organizations, that's in there.
Okay, at the organizational level rather than the individual level. We've got a question here for Lana. You mentioned in your presentation there being sort of an expiration date on the information that's collected in the planning process needing to be collected within 5 years in order to be used in the environmental process. So we know that those planning and project delivery timelines can be kind of long for some projects. Is there still benefit for doing a Pell type approach, even if you're not sure that you're going to be able to advance that planning information into environment within those 5 years?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. So when I was referring to the 5-year timeline, that really has to do with a specific statutory Pell authority in 23 U.S.C. 168, where your goal would be to be able to take your purpose and need or a preliminary range of alternatives after eliminating certain unreasonable alternatives from consideration into the NEPA process and use it directly without really any further work. So if that is your goal, then you have to be extra careful about the timing and making sure that, you know, that's within 5 years of when you begin the NEPA process. Otherwise, you know, the other Pell authorities don't have that specific requirement. And as long as you sort of keep in mind the fact that you do want to make sure that whatever information you're using, basing your decisions off of is still relatively current, it uses, you know, recent and acceptable methodologies, then you still have the ability to either incorporate some of that information through by reference or somehow, you know, use that information maybe with a little bit of extra work and update and things like that in your NEPA process. So documentation is key. You know, again, understanding which what your ultimate goal is. The 5-year requirement only refers to a specific statutory requirement.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I think the questioner had an interest specifically in that developing purpose and need for the project. So that's helpful. Thank you. Here's a question that has come in for you, Brian. You've talked about where Penndot has been and where you are now. Do you have a sense of where Penndot is going next? Of course, that is going to depend on governance from the Penndot secretary, you know, directives from the legislature, new legislation at the federal level. But what's your sense as a long-term career staff member? Where are you guys headed?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. When it comes to things that keep you up at night, that's one of the things that keep me up at night. Because there's several items that I know we need to work on. And one, you know, if you didn't pick up on it through the presentation, is this is a journey, and we're certainly not there yet. So we certainly have a number of things, including just the full implementation, whatever that means. I'm not even sure what that means, of the Penndot Connects approach, or you know, or linking the planning in with the linking land use and transportation planning in with the process. But one of the things we're working on specifically right now is getting better interagency coordination in the process. We have a formal process that we use for large complex EIS, EA processes. It's an agency coordination process that's been in place for a number of years, but it's for project delivery purposes. And we've been using that for planning, but we found that it's not a really great fit, that we think there's a lot of opportunities that might be missed. Lana talked about environmental mitigation opportunities, you know, starting that discussion in planning. And I don't know that we have the robust discussions that we could have if maybe it was a different audience, that we have project delivery folks that are keyed on impacts for 404 permitting, other types of state permitting and such. They have an important role in the process, but their process is later in the design and the engineering and the delivery of the project. We're working on trying to get a group stood up that's more big picture planning approach from both state and federal resource agencies. And we've had a lot of conversations.
We lost Brian for just a moment. I think he'll be back here presently. It sounds like those interagency relationships are kind of in progress, working on developing those over time. If you've got some additional questions for our speakers, please go ahead and pop those in the questions box. There's a comment here from Bob Kuipers. I appreciate the emphasis on cross-jurisdictional collaboration. When projects involve the state, feds, counties, communities, and tribes, stronger success is generally guaranteed. Thank you for that feedback, Bob. Lana or Beth, do you have any response? Just general agreement about that?
Absolutely. Yes, I guess I would put in a note or maybe a comment about tribal coordination, that it seems that many organizations are used to or have established relationships and coordinating early with a whole range of stakeholders, but maybe the tribal governments are either they don't have those established relationships or they're not used to reaching out this early in the process. They might reach out once they start maybe a Section 106 process, but they don't really think to start early on. So I think that's a really great point, that you want to make sure to include them as well. Brian, you're back.
Brian, I think we missed the tail end of what you were saying about interagency collaboration. If there's anything from the very end of your comments that you wanted to repeat, I'll give you that opportunity.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on, I apologize for that. Not sure what happened, but we have our proposal. We have kind of a strategy laid out. So hopefully, if I'm invited back in a year or so, we'll have a whole lot more to talk about on interagency collaboration. But any suggestions or recommendations that any folks with experience that have in the planning process, I'd be certainly open to any suggestions. Thank you.
Yeah, and attendees, you can put that into the questions box as well. It doesn't have to be just things that end in a question mark. So if you have comments about what Brian was discussing about interagency collaboration, that you want to put a short description or link to a document or process, pop that into the questions box and I'll share that out as well. Beth had that question about maintaining those relationship building activities beyond the planning process. So that's ongoing. If you've got examples of that or ways that you have funded that, please put that into the questions box as well. And while we were missing Brian, we talked a little bit about relationships with tribal agencies. Lana, do you have any best practices on how to ensure that that happens early and continuously?
As I was sort of suggesting, people may be more used to engaging with the tribal communities when there is a specific project and they have an idea what more specific impacts may be to cultural resources. But I think that the tribal communities have interests beyond cultural resources. And so, of course, we have a special relationship with the tribal governments and have to acknowledge their specific status. But to include them early on, just as you would any other community, in your project or region that you're engaging in the transportation planning process, and being sensitive to maybe particular constraints that they may have, just as with any other community, whether it's limitations of broadband access, or times of meetings that may not be appropriate for certain members of the community, meeting them in the places that they prefer. All those types of public engagement best practices, I think, are also important and appropriate with the tribal communities.
That's great, thank you. So I don't see anything else coming into the questions box. So this is your last call. If you've got any more questions for our panelists today. And just a reminder, we'll have the recording and the slides posted on ruraltransportation.org this week. I'm not seeing anything else coming in, so I'll go ahead and say thank you once again to our speakers. I really enjoyed your presentations and found them to be really beneficial and informative. So thank you for joining us today, and thanks to all of you attendees. Take care. We'll go ahead and adjourn the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.